This part will be on record. I'll try to give you a view of what's coming. So these are two movies that I borrowed from my colleagues. On the left is a piece of in dilute limit, piece of DNA where you fluorescent label all the DNA molecules and you watch them, the scale is given there. You basically are watching them performing deep Brownian motion, moving around. The resolution is too small to visualize each chain like this, which is done on computer simulation by a colleague from Eugene, Oregon. And very hopefully in a year or so, we will be able to make our own computer simulation visualizing this, not only in this quiescent state, see this is nicely snake-like motion diffuse around, but rather concern ourselves with the issue of large deformation. So one of the examples of large deformation is this one. You make a step strand. People have conducted this kind of experiment for many decades. The perception is after step strand, you ought to see nothing microscopically. It should be quiet, quiescent, nothing should be observable. That view got completely changed about 6 years ago at APS in Baltimore, where this type of movie was shown for the first time. After step strand, we see motion, microscopic, tremendous amount of motion taking place. You watch it again, after step strand of 300%, it has motion. So I'm going to try to review for you what happened since, in particularly emphasizing what we have done in our lab. Yeah. 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 You mean that's last movie? Yeah. So rheologists, they don't even mention what is this. It's always known that this should be about a millimeter. A millimeter. 1 millimeter is the scale for any rheologist that walked into any rheology lab. So it's a millimeter a sample. The size is huge compared to molecules. And I'm eager always to show you, as polymer scientists, how much of this material we're dealing with each year. We are consuming several 100 billion pounds each year worldwide, and this country represents half of that. So 100 billion pounds to 200 billion pounds. 100 billion pounds. And they are still growing according to the chart, the projection, and give you a sense of why it's such a big scale. The shopping bag you use, the lunch bag you use, the package, look at this. Many stories high, you're blowing film out of polyethylene, for example, like this. So it's a big scale, and that really motivates us as physicists. We're supposedly trying to provide answers to behaviors of this 100 billion pounds of material, how they behave intrinsically. So I'm going to go through some background, essential of it, and then review the emerging phenomena that really force us to propose some conceptual pictures, which leads to basically predictions that we were quite unaware of in terms of predicting phenomena that sometimes are even counterintuitive. I know at the end I will go off record and share with you what this insight gives you on glass with new tools and new insight. So background, I'm a physicist working on polymers. So I give you a sense of what polymer physics for us is. There's the polymer, this 100 billion pounds. You know, most of it we're dealing with every day. We're so proud to be polymer scientists because it's just everywhere, polymeric product. They are often in their solid state. But there is a time they are in their liquid state, that's during processing. So we are very much concerned with ourselves with the problem of, in this disordered liquid state, what is the physics, which essentially deals with this 100 billion pounds of polymers undergoing processing. And then that's not useful, that liquid state. You need to for it to be useful, you need to be strong. So for some materials, apparently cooling down to room temperature is good enough to be strong, such as styrene, PET, polycarbonate. And you confront with another set of polymer physics, very hard problems, particularly if you want to understand the nature of a glass transition. We just talked about with Professor Gujarati yesterday, 2 days ago. So we are going to worry once more about maybe end properties, mechanical properties, actually extreme mechanical properties, which means fracture behaviors of polymer in glassy state. Then obviously, for your polymer to be useful, one more time, you need that to be hard and has very strong structural integrity, and you count on having crystallization behavior. So that makes it strong. So for what we know, this rheology, we grow very used to the idea that this subject don't care about microstructures. The reason is we don't care if it's crystallized or not. You all heat it to the disordered state, which I emphasized, in the liquid state. It turns out, I think our experience, we are never smart enough to know all the truths, but experience tells us really we can treat them as styrene is the same as butadiene, as ethylene in this liquid state, as long as we do proper normalization in terms of how to account for their molecular weight effect, for example. Once you have done that, there's no chemical details we need to worry about. The other two fields are different. We are under the impression chemistry is important there. Different microstructure give us different crystallization temperature, give us different glass transition temperature. As if there's something very chemical specific. So my challenge as a physicist is, can I still proceed as a physicist and discount all the chemical details? I mean, chemists will hate me for that. That's fine. The question is whether we can get somewhere. And there is apparently, and I dream, is there is apparently a common link, a common point, which is so relevant as far as we know in rheology. And today we have evidence that it is also very, very important. That's chain entanglement. It's going to play an essential role for this amorphous state. And even crystallization, if you want to concern yourself with crystallization, the kinetics of it, you may still want to deal with the fact the chains are untangled. Then comes the hard problem. What is entanglement? Today, to be humble and modest, you survey anyone in the world, we don't know how to treat and think about entanglement, at least from a point of view of analytical theory. Nobody really can claim that I can describe this ball of rice noodle. Okay? But the least we know is that, let it be linear chains, is that take any coil you have, okay? You find that it occupies a very open space. You need another 50 chains in the same space in order to satisfy the density of that melt. So it's a very clouded situation. All the chains are interpenetrated, mingled together. This gives rise, in a static sense, the picture of entanglement. It arises from the fact chains cannot occupy the same space, which is known as excluded volume. And when the chains are sufficiently long, this excluded volume plus this chain connectivity resulted in the fact it's not processable. So the chains are not processable. Non-processability arises. And this is a typical picture of why we think polymers are untangled. But this is a misleading picture because it's only static. It turns out what we need to think about is not the static picture, but eventually worry about how chains move around each other. So anyway, that's entanglement. Let me go back now to rheology, having made some introduction to motivate you about why rheology can be important, might be important. So this subject supposedly deals with the deformation of flow of materials, and it goes way beyond what polymer materials are. Many different materials involve rheological phenomena. In the sense, excuse me, in the sense that you can generically look at this, any material that's rheologically interesting and important. You basically put your sample between parallel plate, you start to move one of the plate. The amount of movement you have relative to the height defines the degree of deformation. And the rate at which you are moving this defines the rate of deformation. So automatically you start to develop a sense of the degree of deformation as strength and the rate of deformation as shear rate. And then you monitor the force on one of the plate to maintain this deformation, and divided by the area you get the stress. So that's it. I think rheologists is simply concerning themselves with this kind of situation. As you can see, there's no tensor to worry about. It's not even, I'm not even talking about vector. This can be all depicted at the scalar level, as long as we know what we're dealing with. Simple shear, for example, a scalar such as shear rate and stress. So, walking to the rheology lab, what people do then is assuming that this is all possible to just move one of the plate and being able to account for the fact everywhere else deformation field is known, as I depicted here, either in continuous shear, oscillatory shear, or step strength. So this is, in this case, it was conveniently rotational so that you can shear continuously forever. So, is this true? In other words, can we simply assume that by fixing the boundary condition on each plate, we can achieve what we hope to establish, which is what we do in textbook. We assume that that's possible. In other words, in fact, in the last few decades, we have done precisely that. That is, assuming the state of deformation is known, as I depicted. In fact, the second ingredient in rheology is you are not only concerned yourself with the deformation, but you are concerned with the so-called mechanical response. That is, under given deformation, what is happening in terms of your processing, how much electricity you need to have, what's the power you need to have. That's related to the mechanical response. So in the past, we learned everything through the mechanical response, assuming the deformation is well known. In fact, the first paper, some 80 years ago, proceeded precisely that way, by assuming the field is well known to be linear and homogeneous. Proceed to recent years. This is one of the textbook, 2007, doing the same, concerning ourselves with steady state. This is another book that once again concern ourselves with homogeneous deformation. So I'm now going to motivate you why this could be problematic by reminding you, let's do a step strand. That is, you make a step strand and you start to measure the force after a sizable amount of deformation, and you see that your force over a certain period in time does not decay, implying there is some robbery-like response, solid-like. And then, of course, if you are patient enough and wait, you find eventually the force declines if it is a liquid, for example, non-cross-linked polymer. And this can all be obtained, particularly the information about that relaxation time can be obtained by performing this so-called oscillatory shear or small amplitude oscillatory shear. This movie shows peeking into that gap of 1 millimeter. As I sweep the frequency, what happens when I measure the force. Then I find, according to, in agreement with Maxwell, that the response is elastic like when my frequency is very high relative to the relaxation time. What is the relaxation time? It's the time for one of those rice noodles in that picture to swim out of its own initial position, RG away, a distance of its own size away. That time, it takes about a tau time. And that can be experimentally determined, as I try to persuade you as this characterization of rheology. So here comes the elementary. If you can go through the next two slides, you will know why we have uncovered a set of phenomena that is quite different than what we thought how polymer behaves. So that has to do, once again, you see this sample in between parallel plate and moving upper plate with a velocity v. And you ask the question, how long it takes to produce 100% deformation, which means upper plate 1h to the right. How long it takes? Well, then that's, of course, quite trivial, as this formula shows. And it particularly shows this time is something you can control. The time to make 100% deformation is inversely proportional to the velocity of the upper plate. So experimentalists, you have full control. What's good about it? I mean, this time t1, how long it should be, how short it should be, what do I think when I'm saying I'm doing a fast deformation or slow deformation? This T1 itself does not mean a lot. If I cover 50 miles in 1 hour driving a car, is that 1 hour long or short? Well, I'm very fast compared to the bicycle, very slow compared to the airplane. Okay? So that time is meaningless, of 1 hour. To anybody is meaningless, depending on what? In this case, depending on how fast the molecules are moving around. That tau. In particular, that tau is determined by the molecular weight, such as we all know. And therefore, we have the problem of how patient we can be to shear, using this to mimic processing. So in processing, we want to do it as fast as possible, 1,000 tons in 2 days, maybe in whatever factory. So we cannot have patience. We want to run it very fast, which means this T will be small compared. So we won't have time to sit and wait for molecules to move around. And in particular, in fact, polymer scientists all know shear thinning. The moment shear thinning occurs, that is, the viscosity starts to become lower with respect to the rate of shear, is precisely a point where making 100% deformation will take a time as long as tau. But we are always interested in processing faster and faster. Therefore, we're always in the regime where the time it takes to make large deformation is negligibly small. And then, obviously, you ask yourself, what happened to that ball of rice noodle when you do it that fast? When that rice noodle cannot move around. So give you a sense. That rice noodle, each of them, will move around a distance of its own size in 1 minute, let's say. And it's a very realistic examples when we deal with rubber in tire, a minute to move around. Whereas you already pushed your plate to the left 100 H in 1 minute. 100 H to the left within a minute. What happened to that poor ball of rice noodle is the question. And then the second slide. You're only going to go through these 2 slides to have the sense of what's going on. Then let's review something elementary. Again, we put something in 2 plates. We don't know what it is. Treat it as something we don't know. But we know a few things. We applied external boundary condition. The velocity of sudden applied. Then the strength, that is the degree of deformation, will continue to increase linearly with time, as I showed here. If this is a piece of liquid, then Newton, several centuries ago, tells me that you must right away see the stress you sense with your sensor will shoot to a finite value. That's Newton's theory. Why? Because you right away have a slope in gamma. In other words, you right away have a finite shear rate. Newton says if you have a finite shear rate, you should have a finite stress. Okay? It's very elementary. Conversely, if what you put in is a piece of solid, then Newton's contemporary Hooke will tell you that since your strain initially is 0, your stress better start from 0. I really didn't appreciate the simple picture here, because our polymer always has a finite relaxation time. When I examine my sample on time scales very short, I should see hooking behavior. In other words, my force rising from 0 monotonically is a clear indication I'm dealing with a piece of solid. And you know the eventual consequence of this deformation is that ball, spaghetti, whatever, given enough time, it will eventually presumably reach a flow state where stress no longer changes. So you must have this. The question is how it transforms from elastic deformation to flow. It can happen if the rate is very small. It can happen over a time scale around tau, where you are shearing so slowly that basically by the time you make 100% deformation, the molecule has rearranged among themselves and swim the way by diffusion. So that's a very, very gentle way of asking the sample to flow and deform. In that case, you have a smooth connection between elastic deformation and eventual flow. What about the reverse, which is what we're interested in? Fast processing, fast deformation. Can you deform your material elastically? Therefore, your force will monotonically increase indefinitely. When does it come down? Okay? When does it come to a flow state? That's what concerns us. So it turns out this is only 6 years ago. We start to ask that question in a very elementary way. In particular, in this limit, the transition from elastic deformation to flow has been known for 5 decades to occur at a time much shorter than tau, actually. So that ball of rice noodle has to undergo some disastrous arrangement. So in any case, we thought it would be nice, instead of relying on the assumption that this deformation field will be homogeneous, it would be nice to see experimentally whether that's the case for our untangled polymers. So you build this apparatus, spending just a few $100, you can do it, and you find, and welcome to visit our lab, and we have all the commercial rheometers. They are all equipped with such equipment, including some homemade rheometers as well. So what is the emerging phenomenon when you have such a basic elementary method applied? It is first to look at this textbook assumption of homogeneous shear, and you find over a millimeter again, you put some particle light reflecting particles, very small amount in the range of a fraction of a percent by volume. And this movie will play itself repeatedly. And this is just another movie showing steady state of a different solution. You find that this textbook assumption is strongly violated. For those who have sharp eyes, you see the beginning part is homogeneous. And then sample broke apart. My language broke apart. So that homogeneous deformation is really a moment where the force is still monotonically growing, and the point of breaking is beyond that homogeneous rise. So the breaking occurs after the maximum has appeared in your stress signal, the force measurement. So remind you again, these movies are done under the condition of fast shear, so-called. That is to say, you don't give the molecules the chance to diffuse around on this time scale. You basically force this ball of rice noodle to undergo large elastic deformation. Mechanically, it is clear that elastic deformation did not proceed forever, because that would imply your force would monotonically grow. So instead, you find it stopped growing and started to decline. At time scale, still very short compared to what molecular diffusion would allow you to visualize the dynamics. So it's clear, mechanically speaking, that you have elastic deformation. And we start to call this point the yield point because the observed breakup of that sample occurred after the maximum, and beyond which you have plasticity. In other words, the deformation is no longer recoverable. So that is something we start to insist that you should describe the phenomenon this way, this point being yield point. Why? We actually have experimental evidence to allow us to assign significance to the location of the maximum. Because you can shear your sample anywhere before this maximum. And then there are instruments that can let go, in the sense you let the stress go free. That's called let go. Let it so-called undergo elastic recovery. In other words, this is elastic deformation, as I explained. So they actually really go back. But if you shear beyond the maximum and then let stress go free, in other words, turn off the stress, your sample does not recover to its original position. So clearly, there is elastic dominant deformation on the right, on the left, and irreversible deformation to the right of the maximum. And another set of phenomena is even more intriguing and highly unanticipated. That is making the step strand. I showed you a movie in the opening slide of a polymer solution. This is a piece of melt, and you can see this massive, really rupture-like failure if you step strand to 400%. If you step strand to just 200%, then it turns out, okay, so make a stepwise step strand 200%, 2 H's to the right, and it turns out the system struggles for 20 seconds up to. Prior to that, the sample relaxation was quiescent, and then you can see internally breaks apart in absence of any further external deformation. But this is a truly shocking result and completely altered the view that I used to have about what is a large deformation of polymer melts. So the conceptual picture goes as perceiving step, a shear situation. Then you need to remind yourself, unlike the theorist, we live in a real world. It turns out when you construct theory, you need to worry about that issue. That is, in the real world, we only have a finite size. Nothing is infinite. We cannot impose shear without asking some solid boundary to grab my rice noodle and shear it. Okay, so it turns out the very first problem you confront is how the motion, the stress, can transfer from the surface into the sample. It's unimaginable to have a sample that doesn't have a boundary. And by the way, in all processing, of course, you have finite system. You always have to deal with boundary. And so the first thing it turns out for us to make any progress experimentally, I didn't tell you the tricks of making those movies, is you have to fully and completely understand the interaction of your polymer liquid with a solid surface. And in particular, answer the question of what is these noodles sticking on the solid surface going to behave relative to the noodles that are free. So it turns out very soon after the first set of phenomenology arises, we have proposed to understand this by realizing that there are really 3 sets of forces one must consider in order to depict what's happening. And In short, it turns out of the three forces, one is something we are familiar with, the middle one, called retraction force. That is, anytime you deform a chain, the entropy associated with the conformation will give rise to the resistance to deformation. That's elastic force, origin of rubber elasticity. The last force, how the intermolecular chains, how the chains grabbing a given chain and do what, was accounted for previously by tube model with this fictitious tube model. But it does not really explicitly visualize how these chains interact actively and how they interplay. So we find it's necessary to explicitly bring up the issue of intermolecular force. And then there is the third one, which is more mysterious. It is a force associated with the entropic barrier that allows that rice noodle to look like a piece of solid within times much shorter than tau. So before the rice noodle could move around, that piece of melt is quite solid-like, which implies that solid should have a level of cohesion, a strength. And we discovered that is something associated with the fact they are happy to mingle together. Causing them not to mingle, you have to pay a price. So, in short, the least, the minimum, right? Physicists like to talk about minimum model. The minimum model one has to look at is beyond this test chain red. One has to visualize that test chain. The reason it could deform in an external field is because the blue chains are grabbing it and displacing it. So as you displace, the red chain become more deformed, the elastic force in the red chain grows, but cannot grow without bond. It has to stop at some point. At what point? At the point where the force provided to stretch this red chain is of a finite amount. In other words, there should be an intermolecular gripping force of a finite amount, and the force cannot grow beyond that. Beyond that, sliding has to take place, as I wrote here. And then there's the other set of phenomena. Remember the step strands. That is, instead of hold my blue chain and displace, all of a sudden I stop stretching. So it turns out when I displace the displacement stops, this intermolecular force drops to a different level. And that allows the elastic retraction force to be much stronger upon shear scission. And as a consequence, this elastic force could overcome this entropic barrier to achieve a phenomenon known as what we call elastic yielding, which is the movie you see where after shear scission, the material breaks apart. I think there are two papers that describe this, a subsequent 2009 paper. I think what we're left with, inevitably, is this picture. Looking at any given test chain, depicted here by this rubber band, with my finger being the blue chain, intermolecularly stretching this given test chain, which is the same as every other chain. This external deformation could only cause molecular deformation as depicted as you see the lengthening of the spacing to a degree reaching the force imbalance point beyond which there is not enough force to hold this intermolecular chain. And the intermolecular chain driven by the elasticity of its own elastic tension and will retract. And that gave rise to the measured drop of the force that I told you beyond the maximum stress, so-called stress overshoot. So I think this type of picture is going to stay with us it's really a question of whether there is an analytical way to account for this picture, to describe such a picture. Well, the picture was so powerful that it allowed us to make many predictions. And I return to reality again, that you cannot go processing, you cannot go to a rheology lab without worrying about the interface between the polymer. and your sample, and the wall. And this is another particle tracking movie. I don't know if you can make the sense out of that movie. It's going to repeat again. You shear, start up right away. You see, it's all nice. And that's the point where the polymer is still in good interaction with the surface. So that allows this shear to continue homogeneously. And the movie subsequently show, upon breaking, watch, it retracts because there's nothing to grab the sample anymore from the surface. Ultimately, you see, that's ultimately steady state. You have this constant slip, as I depicted. This picture, I had it 15 years ago. What progress we made? Well, previously, we worried only about the fact polymers of high molecular weight can undergo tremendous amount of wall slip, as you can microscopically visualize. What we did not worry about is how it comes from no slip to slip, such as this movie shows. It didn't slip initially. So we didn't address the question of how that comes about. And that is, of course, all in the picture that I just explained to you, the molecular picture. So now we really have a good understanding of wall slip. In particular, we have a prediction. This paper described this prediction and the relationship with other theories, such as Dejean's theory, which only works for steady state. We have a prediction that's totally counterintuitive. In both movies, you see that if I have not stopped shearing, I would not have seen wall slip. Yet, stopping shearing caused wall slip to take place. So that's a prediction, and that arises from the fact if I have the blue chain, red chains displacing relative to each other, then I can still deform. I can still maintain the relationship between red and blue chain. But if I stop, the blue chain lose grab of the red chain. The red chain has its elastic force, and that pulled itself out of the rest of the tethered chains, and that causes wall slip or disentanglement. So that's the first prediction. The second prediction has to do with unifying shear and extensional rheology field. So usually, when you do shear, you don't do extension because it involves different instruments. So typically, our community is divided into people who do shear and people who do extension in the past. So in the past, I confess we never did extension. But the molecular picture we had forced us to realize that there must be the universal same physics governing the behavior in extension. And we were lucky in the right time. My student lucky, and I'm lucky, because someone from Goodyear, employer actually, invented a setup based on improving previous ideas that you can put it on a rotational rheometer, right? Many of us know that. And all of a sudden you can do extension. So not only you have the instrument, but you also know why you want to do it. So the why you want to do part is that we realized that in extension, you must have the same problem of force imbalance. In other words, I stretch my chain, but that deformation cannot continue indefinitely because that force cannot grow beyond what I can stretch with the finite amount of force. So the chain sliding, or so-called descent, must take place. And we quickly realized, this is the work of Yang, that we should look at the total force. That force will reach a maximum. The drop of the beyond the maximum is a result of the slippage of chains or disentanglement. And this is highly, highly controversial. So for us, it was quite straightforward to think that this maximum, once more, is describing a yield point. In other words, we are so sure that the right question to ask is to ask why this tensile force will drop, physically or molecularly speaking. So let me remind you, in shear, we already know that this maximum has its significance because it really divides elastic deformation from the irrecoverable deformation. It's not recoverable, you see that? So if you do extension, traditionally, we are treating polymer as a liquid. Liquid doesn't remember its history. Therefore, we like to think about a quantity that updates itself momentarily. And therefore, we look at true stress. That is the tensile force dividing by the instant area that's shrinking upon extension. So if you look at that signal strongly grows because of elastic deformation. And then it starts to soften, meaning the growth of that tensile force start to be less strong, less rapid. But it's still monotonic, therefore somewhat featureless. It turns out it's more convenient for the same set of data, look at the true stress. That is, the tensile force divided by the original area. And that, as I showed you and promised, that shows a maximum. And we start to call that the yield stress again, or yield point again. Highly controversial. People are, we are really having to do a lot of work to persuade my colleagues here. But I have a piece of information, or more than one piece, show you one. That is, once again, I do extension. If I stop stretching and let go, okay, just let go of my specimen. If I let go before the maximum, the sample goes back to its original length and dimension. And conversely, if I stretch on the other side and let go, any point beyond this maximum, I don't see that recover. So once again, as an experimentalist, forget about any molecular picture for now. It is pretty clear this point has some physical significance. We know conceptually better than that, so I give you the explanation, but we actually quickly realized the thing to look at is the total force for the following reason. Imagine your ball of rice noodle indeed is nothing but a network, and it takes tau time for the molecule to move around. Therefore, if you have time much shorter than tau, it's like a cross-link sample. So if you have 6 load-bearing strands in the tensile direction, if I quadrupled my length without reaching the force imbalance point, without reaching enough tension in the chain for the chain sliding to take place yet, then I should still have 6 strands bearing load. Meanwhile, my area has dropped by a factor of 4 without question. So in that limit of no escaping of entanglement, you have something that we can resort to the class of rubber elasticity and perceive that my force will monotonically grow with extension. What's the consequence of that? I'm looking head-on into that cross-section. Each of the ball is my load-bearing strand now. If I have a dozen load-bearing strands to begin with, if I did not reach the point of sliding and what I call chain disentanglement, I will still have that dozen, except now in a much smaller area. That has to be the reality. And in contrast, you don't need to worry about this issue, or you don't have this issue. You don't have the benefit of even thinking about this issue in shear. The shear is always imposed onto an area of a fixed number. The area does not change. So the shear problem, in that sense, is a much easier problem. You don't even need to think about picking and choose what is the true stress, what is engineering stress, which one represents what. So at the end, extension involves 2 steps. The first step I call geometrical condensation. We are applying this significant insight to learn about glass physics today. And it does not continue forever, right? The point of chain sliding will occur. You ask, what about chain scission? No, it's going to be stretching so much it breaks. It turns out in melt, the stress level is so low, it does not happen. Give you an update, we're working on glass. Even in glass, it rarely would happen, sensation. So in any event, that's a long story for many years to uncover. In any event, you don't have much sensation. All that's left is the fact eventually they slip. In other words, they are forced to move relative to each other instead of by diffusion, which would take a time you are impatient to wait for. And then you may have flow if everything else goes well, and I will show you it doesn't. It's disastrous. So once again, it's this kind of story that I'm telling you. So up to the point I'm reaching the maximum, you see, I'm not losing any strength, so this thing just geometrically condensed. So this picture more or less describes this whole process from 1 to 2 to 3. So that's prediction number 2. Number 3 is, again, if I see this elastic breakup in shear after shear session, then I should see the same in extension. How nice, how easy it is to write a PRL when you know the answer. Right? I mean, so this can happen, and we predicted and then went to the lab and found that to be the case. And this has to do with the magnistics of the problem. We realized the reason you have strength localization or shear banding is because all of a sudden you apply so much strength, you're moving many H's within tau. This poor ball of rice noodle can do nothing but victimize a portion of that rice noodle and have them slide, the rest doesn't have to slide. That's the reality. Then we propose that what if I slowly move my upper velocity, eventually to the same speed, but very slowly. Takes 8 hours, it turns out. So during this time, so it's much longer than tau. So we are happy, we make sure the molecules, the rice noodles are happy, given them enough time to diffuse around. It turns out then you avoided shear banding. So this is the steady state if you abruptly apply the shear versus you infinitely slowly apply the shear. This is very troubling conceptually. Depending on how you impose the shear, despite the fact your final external boundary condition is the same, you end up having very different rheological state, very different states, as you can see. And that's very hard for theory to treat, to think about. All the constitutive theory, particularly integral equation type theory, would think there is a memory term. That memory could not only memorize a time scale on order of tau or some small time scale, beyond which you have amnesia. You don't remember anything, and everything should be the same, but it's not. More than that, this more troubling than that, this says you can achieve either state. Then you start to wonder which one is really a truly steady state. And we are led to think that the fact you have strength localization or shear banding, as I showed you here, is only a metastable state, conceptually, meaning it's locked into that state without getting out, being able to get out of it. So a few noodles happily sliding past, and then the rest of the noodle knows, and no, you are getting victimized, I don't have to do anything, and they just stay there, metastably. So, one of the last thing, really close to my heart is really the whole game of doing rheology, learning about basics in rheology, is to have a guiding principle for process. That's the ultimate goal. And here's one called a gross melt fracture. And there is a way you can demonstrate why the large distortion of the extrude arises from something complicated at the entry. So here's what you do. You get a rheometer, get hold of a rheometer. You push your material into the die, which means the material has to be squeezed from there to the die. And then you sit there, wait, until this sample, just do nothing. Until this sample already forgot it went through some dramatic history coming in. Every molecule all relaxed. And then you start your experiment. And that's this movie. So remember, the sample that's already in the die is relaxed, already forgot it went through the entry. And this part that's initially being extruded out comes out smoothly, beautifully, because it didn't undergo. It was sitting there resting already. Now what's coming out is is the material that's constantly being fed in to the sun. And so that's the smooth part. The rest is distorted because this residence time is so short. The sample still remember the nasty history it went through at the entry. And these are some of the movies that shows the nasty. So this is the barrel, and this movie takes a look at the whole barrel. This is the movie from Xiangyang. And this is the movie that's at the right corner of that barrel, and you see something very, very drastic. And I should pick this type of movie because this is, again, very alarming. It, for us, confirms that the shear is taking place in a discontinuous manner in the sense, look at that. There is internal quote-unquote slippage, if you like. Something is causing the noodles to pass each other at this interface, saving the rest from doing anything. They sit there. And in this case, you have even dramatic, slip-like behavior taking place. In any case, this is very alarming. We have spent lots of time doing finite element calculations in the past, where the constitutive equation involve parameters that are spatially constant. This appeared to show that your structure, the state of entanglement, is different everywhere, particularly across this boundary. And therefore, our depiction will have to account for this kind of behavior. So lastly, you have this squeezing, which occurs in injection molding in many applications. And again, the particle tracking was trying to give you a sense of what we anticipate to be a strand localization. And Xiangyang discovered that this strand localization actually occurs in the form of shear yielding. Look at that, it's at the 45, at the angle. And you can perform an analysis realizing that the squeezing of the sample by a surface, in this case, constant force, you can decompose that force, okay, into an inclined plane and think about a shear stress on that plane. Okay? And that shear stress, if it's high enough, could produce what I showed you in simple shear geometry of the strand localization. In other words, finding a place to undergo failure through chain disentanglement. So I'm reaching the end of this, and there's things beyond prediction, really beyond prediction, because we really didn't think we would be able to say much about it. But it has so much to do with processing, in this case, particularly rubber-related processing. It turns out when you do extension, depending on the rate you use, there are different behaviors that can be classified. There is one that we call tensile failure. You watch, it happens at low rate. This movie is speed up. You can see that it's being speed. Look at that. It breaks very sharply, quote unquote rupture-like. And then when you go to higher rate, it stops behaving like this. The contrast between them is quite drastic. It doesn't do that vertical rupture-like behavior, and instead you may call it necking. It's very different. And even at higher rate, you have really like a cross-link rubber. This is without cross-linking, okay? But you're stretching fast. You find this filament break up. Look at that, break up like a window glass. Despite the fact you have no cross-link. So these behaviors start to be understood by us, and in particular, you can apply the same idea and put some particles on the sample. Although you are doing a tensile deformation, you can project that tensile force into an inclined plane and realize for yourself, there is a shear stress that exists on that sample. And the system knows the chain, and it's very intuitive. The chain knows to slide this way perpendicular, along the stretching direction is much more difficult than at an angle, which is by shear. So the shear yielding become the favored mode that leads to failure or initialize the non-uniform deformation. So I'm reaching the end of it. I know a few people you have not seen, the older generation. Pooyan left. He is now at the Delft, taking an assistant professor in Netherlands, staying in academia. Sham went to industry for a year and then decided the fun place to go is back home in India. So he went back. Yang is doing postdoc, planning to become a professor. Xiangyang is here, Greg is here. Xin went to Millikan, and we have a bunch of new members as well. So in summary, I'm back to the beginning. This picture of shark skin intrigued me for more than a decade. In other words, I knew about this phenomenon for 15 years, maybe 17 years. And it's nice, you see, so it's a piece of rubber extruded out of a cylindrical die. It comes out so this is with increasing pressure. So the movie is progressing, coming out faster and faster. So you have this so-called shark skin type of malfracture. Nasty. In fact, the word fracture is perhaps not a completely misleading concept. We couldn't deal with it. What's the physics? But today, I think we have a fairly satisfying explanation for why and how this is nothing but the chain disentanglement that I showed you in much better controlled geometries. And then, of course, these movies are the ones that are giving us the insight to solving, these kind of problems that in the film blowing is taking place every day. The entire world spends millions of dollars adding additives to get rid of that problem so you can blow your film fast enough. Otherwise, the nature of this problem ruins your film blowing. So there are questions about how to do industrially, right? In any case, the problem I'm dealing with is quite difficult in the sense you are really dealing with a 6-order magnitude of gap in the length scales. We are concerned about processing all in millimeter scales, but what's responsible for what you see macroscopically, MA macroscopically, is really, I hope I convinced you, and then that's where the next level of computer simulation has to come in. It really, the molecular chains, their behavior are really responsible for what you see on these microscopic scales. None of these techniques tell you anything about molecular scale problems. So the guessing game is very hard, trying to figure out the 6-order magnitude of gap in the length scale. So in any event, I think we are looking at a phenomenological foundation that are based on these observations. And it reminds me, I'm teasing the audience, so instead of viscoelastic, it reminds me that viscoelastic term for nonlinear rheology should be reversed and called elastoviscous. Because it's really elasticity first and then plasticity next, right? So for nonlinear rheology, we should reverse that word. So I'm very, very intrigued by the idea of strand localization. I think anyone who can mathematically solve that problem is going to deserve a huge recognition about how the spatially correlated events occurs. They communicate to each other. All the theory we typically know today is the theory for X, Y, Z. So it's very intriguing, and I hope I can live long enough to see a solution to that. And certainly, so then there are several levels of theoretical challenges. So with that, I think I want to go off record